Welcome to another edition of EThekwini Matters. I'm your host, Simpiwe Dlamini. This week we are discussing all things climate change. We were joined by Itumeleng Masenya, who is the manager climate change mitigation here at EThekwini Municipality. Itumeleng, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Simpiwe.
You've got such a very interesting title, Climate Change Mitigation Manager. What do you do?
When we respond to climate change, there are two strategies. One is to adapt to the impacts of climate change, which refers to reducing the climate risks. Alternatively, we mitigate against the impacts of climate change, and by that we refer to reducing the greenhouse gas emissions, which of course contribute towards global warming. That's more or less the difference between the two. So as a result, my focus and mandate in the city is to assist the different sectors in that in their operations they reduce their contribution towards greenhouse gas emissions.
Can you just take us through that? What was the purpose of having that workshop?
Yes, the workshop was actually as a result of the directive that was issued by Your Worship, the Mayor, during the meeting that we had with him for the EThekwini Municipality Climate Change Committee that is led by Your Worship, which is providing the oversight over the work that we do in the city. So during that meeting held in April, what we're discussing with Your Worship was the pending climate change bill, which of course once it's promulgated is going to be an act, so meaning that we're going to be legally required to respond towards the bill, and of course do the necessary plans, develop the necessary plans, but importantly of course produce the sectors within the city produce the required response strategies and plans on how they're going to be reducing the climate risks related to their operations, as well as the greenhouse gas emissions, as I've indicated. But most importantly, the workshop, what it sought to achieve, and which was also one of the reasons why the Mayor, Your Worship, requested that we of course organize the workshop, is that the bill requires that going forward, the city, in terms of our governance structure, must of course establish a multi-stakeholder forum, which of course is going to be constituted and led by Your Worship, but importantly, it must also comprise of the different councillors that we have, as well as the sectors, but most importantly, as I've indicating, which is the distinct feature about this multi-stakeholder forum, is going to also be constituted by the external stakeholders. This would of course refer to your NGOs, it will refer to the private sector, it will refer to your academia, the researchers, the labor organizations. And of course during the workshop we did just apprise the audience and the people that came to attend, which was quite successful, about the status of the bill that currently is still sitting with Parliament. So once it becomes a law, we'll make it a point. So we're trying to be preemptive as always and be proactive. So we won't wait until that becomes the law, and as you know that the city will always in the forefront. So that was as a result of that, trying to be proactive as well.
Yeah, I see. I also noticed that majority of the people that attended the workshop were councillors. Why is it important for councillors to be workshopped about this bill?
We always say in terms of climate change, and I always like making this analogy to the COVID situation, it's one of those topics that is scientifically mostly debated in the scientific world, but also has a lot of political connotations. As scientists we can do as much as we can, but you cannot achieve much until such time that of course you have the political leadership, the political will to, of course, enforce as well as implement the policies and all these, well heralded and good plans and strategies. So in terms of climate change, that is quite critical. And of course, I must point out as the people that came, although unfortunately we didn't have our mayor who would have loved to be there, but indeed, as you saw, that we still had a lot of our political principals. We had the speaker as well as our deputy mayor, of course. Yes.
Now, I want us to shift our focus now to the threats, climate change threats globally. Can you just take us through those threats?
As we always say that, of course, the threats globally, have been identified, and we always say that, of course, much as Africa's, contribution towards the global greenhouse gas emissions, when we're talking about climate change currently, of course, one thing that I must point out, there is the natural phenomenon in terms of climate change, but the one that we're referring to, that we're talking to, is the one that is human-induced. And that one is as a result of the greenhouse gas emissions. And the greenhouse gas emissions are as a result of the fossil fuels that we use. And this, of course, contributes towards global warming that we're talking to. So some of the threats that have been identified, they range from your heat waves, the floods, as we have seen here in the global south, and of course here in EThekwini, as the city, we had done our work and had conducted some of the vulnerability assessment studies as way back as 2014 or even earlier than that, and as way back as in 2015 when we produced our Durban climate change strategy. Some of the risks that we had projected were around, the flash floods, and of course we've already seen that. We were talking about the coastal storm waters. We experienced that in 2017, and we had a resurgence of that again in 2019, and we just had another episode, of course, last year in April 2022, and of course recently with this mini tornado. Yes.
But then, Itumeleng, people will then ask that, okay, it's well and good, you are having all these conferences, but what are you actually doing on the ground now to prevent the incident that you've just mentioned now, with the recent one, the 2022 floods?
April,
yes. What are you guys doing to prevent that from happening?
As I've indicated earlier, that of course there are two strategies to respond to the impacts of climate change. One is through adaptation, which is of course reducing the climate risk, and one of course is to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions. And my colleague, Dr. Sean Odono, he's responsible for the climate change adaptation in the city. But of course, as you might have also picked up during the workshop, that as the climate change function, ours is to, of course, advise and develop the strategies. We don't have the capacity nor the capabilities of implementing. We work through the sectors, the departments that I've identified, those that, of course, are mitigation focused. I've indicated them. And then, of course, we have the adaptation focus. We have this coastal stormwater department. We have the water and sanitation, and a whole range of them. And indeed, I must point out that a lot of our departments, they are doing a lot. They've got, of course, their strategies and adaptation plans, which were, of course, they did outline some of them during the workshop. So just to come to your, the question around what we do on the ground, of course, we work very, closely with our departments to come up with the responses. As you might have picked up that particularly in Quarry Road, though, of course, there the communities were impacted, but fortunately, and through the interventions and the proactive work that the department, as well as our city, our coastal department, have put in place, working with the communities, we didn't have any fatalities.
Okay.
So we have what they call, of course, the early warning system. So what that means is that, of course, they've, and the collaboration, and that's what we always indicated, and hence, it was one of the primary objectives for the workshop. As the city, we can only do so much, but of course, we rely more on the external stakeholders, the partnerships and the collaboration with them. So my colleagues have a forum, so to speak, with the communities in Quarry Road, wherein, of course, when there's any, threatening and extreme weather forecast, there is some communication through the WhatsApp that they have set up, and then they know, and they, most importantly with climate change that we have learned is that you can only do so much in terms of mitigation. You can deploy and employ as much technological options as much as possible, but at the end of the day, it always relies, or rather depends on the behavioral changes, but of course, importantly as well, working and collaborating with the people, the communities. So that's our best strategy more than anything. Yes.
So am I correct then to assume that all that you've just mentioned now is part of the Durban climate change strategy, as well as the Durban action plan? If am I correct in assuming that, can you please tell us more about the Durban climate change strategy, as well as the Durban action plan?
Of course, thanks. We did deploy, or rather develop the Durban climate change strategy, and was approved in June 2015. And importantly was on this theme around, collaboration and working with the communities. The Durban climate change strategy had 10 themes, and one of the critical themes was around knowledge management, and that a particular theme is talking about how important it is, because, of course, our people, much as they have a lot of indigenous knowledge, they would know traditionally as to, when the weather is like this, what it means and all that. But then, of course, it's also our responsibility as the practitioners, as the experts, to make sure that we empower, and as I've indicated, the Quarry Road case study is a classic example of that, to demonstrate how important it is to work with the communities and make sure that you empower them with the knowledge, so that they know when there's any threatening weather and changes and forecasted, what do they do? So that's what it had, and of course that was approved in 2015. And subsequent to that, as the city, as you know, that we one of in the forerunners in climate change globally and of course nationally. We were selected. We had been a member city of a network, a global network called a Climate Leadership Group, otherwise known as C40. And as part of that, of course, because of the work that we put out there, always being innovative and being leading, in terms of our responses, we had been selected as the only African city. That was, of course, subsequent to the Paris Agreement that all the nations ratified or signed, and of course, South Africa was one of those countries. So subsequent to that, C40 then developed a deadline, what they call Deadline 2020 framework. So that was just to guide us in terms of how do we then reduce our, average temperatures to the pre-industrial levels. So the city was selected to pilot, to be one of the 8 cities globally, of course, to pilot the Paris Agreement framework. So the biggest distinction or distinctive feature of the climate action plan as opposed to the Durban climate change strategy. Still has 10 themes, of course, and in place of the knowledge management, we have gone even further and referred to it as inclusivity, because and as we indicated, you know, the common denominator or theme throughout the workshop that we had as well, and our way, you know, in terms of responding has been, you know, being inclusive, and this multi-stakeholder forum that we're hoping to establish is also another classic example of how inclusive we trying to be as the city, you know, making sure that, of course, we don't just collaborate with the communities, but they also they become part of the critical part of our planning processes. Yes.
Yeah, I stand to be corrected here.
Yes.
Itumeleng, I know that you were the first city to develop the climate change strategy, and it was presented in the C40 by our mayor. Yes. What was the reaction when you guys presented this strategy?
As I've indicated, it was both an honor, of course, and as well as a responsibility, you know, to be selected to pilot this, and not just, of course, as I've indicated, as the only city here in South Africa, but in Africa as well. So when you are in these forums, when you come up with the responses and interventions, you're not just talking on behalf of Durban, but you're talking on behalf of Cape Town, but you're also talking on behalf of Dar es Salaam, you know, and Lagos as well, and all those cities, of course, making sure that whatever interventions that you come up with, and also guarding against, obviously, those global north tensions, making sure that at the end of the day, whatever the interventions that you collectively agree upon are a true reflection of where you're coming from, but also they will be received, and of course there will always be some obstacles and hurdles to overcome, because like we understood and we realized the mammoth task ahead of us, because as you'd understand, you know, being selected to pilot the Paris Agreement framework, we're already aware of, you know, the odds that were stacked against us, because as the country, South Africa, it was, of course, viewed that in Paris, what all the countries were requested to do was to deposit or declare, you know, what is referred to as their intended contributions, meaning that they were sort of making commitments to say that as the respective countries, this is how much of, you know, greenhouse gas emissions in view of other imperatives and challenges like our developmental challenges and all that, but to say that taking all this into cognizance, this is how much we feel that we can contribute. But it was felt that, you know, the indices that we deposited were not ambitious enough. So already when we were selected, we knew that, you know, whatever the actions, what we refer to as actions, but actions are basically, you know, referring to the projects or programs and all that. We're going to be going, you know, against the tide. We're going to be more ambitious than the national, you know, standards. I can make a classic example, you know, with our air quality standards. They might be obviously on the level of the World Health Organization, but whereas our national standards are still more lenient, so to speak, and not so ambitious enough. So we now, you know, when we approach these things, we feel that we can still make a change and have that bottom-up approach, so to speak.
And the fact that it's Africa that is coming up with all of these
innovative
ideas.
Yes, but at the end of the day, of course, we're still cognizant of our developmental challenges, of course, yes.
I mean, Itumeleng, I want us now to turn our focus of what can we do now as members of the public to reduce the impact on climate change. I mean, you can come up with all these strategies, documents that we can, but the responsibility lies with us now
Yes.
to then act. What can we do as ordinary people?
Yes, thanks. I think as I've indicated, I mean, as the city, in terms of our greenhouse gas emissions contribution, we only contributing around 3%, 6% max, and at times, the colleagues within the different sectors will even ask, why should we bother? But of course, as we say, we need to be seen to be walking the talk, leading from the front. But most importantly, coming to your question, what can the communities do? A lot. And, our theme is always like saying that we cannot do this alone. And surely we're relying on a private sector, we're relying on the communities and a whole lot of other actors and players. And as ordinary people, simple acts like, of course, we are aware of some challenges, and hence, one of the plans that was outlined during the workshop by the head and the current acting DCM of Human Settlement, Mr. Manyati, the pending project around the electric buses. As I've indicated, that the transport sector is one of those sectors that are contributing, I think, in the range of around 26% of our greenhouse gas emissions. And even globally, the transport sector contributes quite a lot. So where possible, of course, we encourage members of the public that in terms of, because like we look at our modal split, where we find that a lot of people still, rely on the use of their private vehicles as opposed to the public transport. So where possible, so hence those are some of, the low-hanging or opportunities that, of course, we always go for, to say that let's look at how we obviously look at our public transport. So there's a number of, a range of interventions that our colleagues in the ETA are working around, the e-buses that I'm talking, I've just referred to, and that, of course, they are currently still busy with, the RPT, and they've now dropped the IP, saying that, or rather they are saying that it's no longer repeat, but you're working around this integrated
but
bus.
at least we're getting there.
Yes, we're getting there, of course, because like they had launched, I think, last year or so, the first phase of it. So it's still work in progress. We're hoping that they do something. And most importantly, also what we pointed out during the workshop, the role that development planning plays in the scheme of things. It's one of those, and we always say that, of course, the land use planning decisions that are taken today will not only impact the current, operations or how the city, develops, but will impact even, how the city is in 10 years, in 20 years' time. So, as an example, they are the custodian of, the decisions around where do we develop in the city, whether we want those, it's a walkable city, or of course we change our transport system and all that. So they help shape, the city in terms of how it develops going forward. So it's critical that, of course, and one of the things that the head of development planning was also emphasizing is that, of course, currently one of the things that they consider as part of the decision making is this 1 to 50 year flood as a barrier, so to speak. Yes, but then to say that going forward, of course, they need to increase it, because what it means is that obviously previously when those thresholds were like established, they were projecting that we won't be experiencing these extreme weather events at the frequency that we now, of course, experiencing. So as members of the public, there's a lot from, in the households where we live. Not only is that, will be your contribution towards reducing the greenhouse gas emissions, but it will save you some rands and cents, of course. You know, you do your little bit, you know, become water, you know, savvy, you, where possible, of course, use public transport and, you know, planting of the trees. Those small actions, they contribute. And then, of course, also, you know, as a mitigation, you know, against load shedding, but also contributing towards the use or less use of fossil fuel sources, you know, if possible, you know, and if it's economically enough, and then putting your PV panels at your household. Yes.
Well, Itumeleng, before you confuse us any further, let's just hold it here for this week.
Yes, of course. There's a lot. There's a lot.
Yes. But thank you so much for coming through. And any passing shots?
We saying that thank you. Well, we like to obviously, you know, subsequent to the successful workshop that we had last week, and of course the participation, but more than anything, the support of the leadership in the city, importantly from the sectors. We say that, of course, as our slogan, so to speak, we cannot do this alone. We need, I mean, climate change is everyone's business. Yes, so we like to say that let's all do our bit in our households, in our workplaces, and as I've indicated, you know, using alternative transport where possible won't only be, you know, your contribution towards climate change, but it might also save you some rands and cents.
Yeah. Well, that's all we had for you this week. Don't forget to like and subscribe. The details are on the bottom of the screen. See you next week. Thank you for watching.